students, I want to introduce all of you guys to Mark, and you can just call him Mark today. I think that'll be easier on everybody. And I thought I would kind of get the ball rolling, Mark, by asking you the first question, which is, really easy, straightforward, biographical one. Maybe you could tell the kids, a little bit about where you're from, when you were born, a bit about your family, and so on.
Sure. I was, and is it okay if I call you Scott with the kids around, or should I
That's
call you?
You can call me Scott. Don't worry about
Okay.
that. I'm gonna leave my Zoom name as Mr. Masters because it's just too much of a pain to change all the time. But
I
go ahead.
understand, and I understand. I was born at a very young age, in Altoona, Pennsylvania. I was one of 10. Um, two of the children died at birth. My mother and father were a good Catholic family from Altoona. I was born on May 11, 1948, at the very end of World War II. My I am number 8 of 10. I had 7 brothers and 2 sisters. The poor girls never got a chance to be ladylike. They ended up being ruffians, like we all did, as you will see in some of those pictures. Now, in one of the pictures, there's all of us together, and there are only 8 because I did have an older brother and an older sister who did die at birth. So I come from a family of veterans. My dad was a World War II veteran, but he was a National Guardsman in World War II. My dad already had 3 or 4 children at that point in life, so they did not call him to duty overseas, James. They actually called him to do duty at a place called Camp Drum, New York, which is up in the northern section of New York State, not too far from the Canadian border. And he served there doing stateside duty for them. But I did have a brother, my oldest brother was in the Air Force. My next brother down was an Army veteran who also served in Vietnam. He served there in 64, 65 before I was there. And then I had another brother in between us, that was an Army veteran who served in Fort Richardson, Alaska, they called them scope dopes. They were part of the NORAD early defense warning system that was along the Arctic Circle, that ended up being just watching for enemy missiles, and his head went around in circles and around in circles.
And some of the students who have taken history with me last year will definitely remember our discussions of the Cold War. We talk a lot about those missile warning systems because many of them, of course, were in Canada.
It was an interesting time. It was a carefree time, except for the Cold War was going on. Today we have COVID and all of those issues that we deal with. Back then, we dealt with the threat of nuclear war. I can remember I went to parochial school in Altoona, Pennsylvania, St. Leo's, and I can remember doing air raid drills where, you jumped under the desk. We now know that jumping under a desk would have given us 0 to little defense against a nuclear attack, but I can remember all of that. And once again, it was a carefree time. The sense of of just being an easy time to grow up, and riding your bicycle and doing all of that was kind of a neat time. So it wasn't difficult in the 50s and 60s. Now, I was young throughout most of the 50s. I was born in 48. So by the time the 50s were gone, I was 12 years old.
And I was just going to say, Mark, I want to ask a follow-up to see if you remember. I show the students in class, but do you remember the name of the cartoon character that taught you to duck and cover?
Boy, you're really testing me. I can't remember, Scott, what I had for breakfast sometimes. But I can't remember who that. I do remember that cartoon, but I don't remember who it was or what his name was.
I'll give you a hint. He was a turtle. They are James, I can see you saying something. Are you, you're muted? Do you mean you? Oh, some of them are probably looking it up now, but that was Bert the Turtle. I always forget when, in the age in which we live, you can ask questions and people can look it up if they don't know off the top of their head. That's the way things are. What about big events during the 1950s, Mark? In class, we talk an awful lot about the advent of television. Did your family have a television?
Oh, my heavens, Scott, yes, we did. But we lived in a rural area around Altoona. There were two television stations at the time. One was out of Altoona, Pennsylvania, and one was out of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And we had a hill behind our house, a mountain, and we put an antenna on top of that and ran a wire the whole way down to the house just to pick up those two stations. And there was no color TV back then. It was all black and white. And at one point in life, I can remember vividly that we actually taped a rainbow-esque piece of plastic over the TV so that it looked as if it was color. And I can remember color TV coming out and being very being the aha moment and things like that. You ask about things that happened in the 50s and 60s, major events. I'm going to guess that, naturally the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy is the one that I remember the most. Um, I can remember, the 60s landing on the moon. I can remember exactly where I was when, John Kennedy was assassinated, when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, which, by the way, was on the same day that I left for Vietnam. Um, and I can remember all those monumental dates like that just because of them being burnt and etched in my brain in history. Of course, there's not a whole lot of brain left there.
Uh,
Elvis, my heavens, yes. I can remember Elvis first coming out in the late 50s, 58, 59, and he was a very controversial subject, James. When he was on TV, because he gyrated his hips, they kept the camera from his hips up that you couldn't see him doing that. That's how censored TV was back then. And then I can also remember the Beatles coming onto the Ed Sullivan. Back then, we had what were called variety shows, and Ed Sullivan ran one of them. And that show was he was the first to bring the Beatles on, and I thought that all the young ladies your age now probably were about to faint at that. So yes, I remember them both vividly.
and you would have been the perfect age for that, I guess. Well, for Elvis, you would have been pretty young, just around maybe 8 or 9 years old. But for the Beatles, you would have been right in high school.
And I was right there with them. I mean, the Beatles, Elvis, both of them. That whole transition period where we went from the crooner Elvis to the rock, yeah, 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 Beatle band. So
And I was wondering, Mark, I mean, in such a big family, when we talk about the 50s in class, we talk about the suburbs and white picket fences and all those kind of stereotypical things. What kind of neighborhood did you grow up in?
we were very poor, Scott. I mean, my dad was a railroader. I mean, not out on the road, but worked in the car shops in Altoona. Altoona was a very large railroading town because that lies right on the very western or eastern side of the Allegheny Mountains, which are part of the Appalachian. And to get up onto that plateau and go across America, it took a lot of steam engines in the old days to go from the bottom. But not only did it take a lot of them to go from the bottom up, because you would stack them up behind the train and push it, it would also you had to come back down, and you needed lots of braking to bring them back down. So we lived in a very poor town. My dad was on and off with his job. The railroad thought nothing of bringing somebody to work. They'd work for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they were laid off, or furloughed is what the word they used back then. So ours was not a typical white picket fence family whatsoever. We were a very, very poor family. My dad actually, and I can remember it vividly in the 50s and 60s, actually hauled coal because that was the primary way of heating homes. He bought a small truck that during those off times with the railroad, in order to feed the family, he would haul coal and then take the ashes out that the fuel caused. There were always lots of ashes that needed to be hauled out. So we did not live a typical family in that manner, although we survived, and it was a good life, and we were Christian people, and we believed in God, and we believed in family, and we stayed together, and we took care of each other. We weren't a family of needs.
And I will do a really quick share screen here, Mark, because you got some great photos that depict this
Okay.
part of your life. So I think this is a good opportunity to show some of those. So
Okay.
this one, I take it, is you as a baby.
That was me on the day I was baptized. That would have been sometime around mid-November of 1948. I'm going to guess I was like 5 or 6 months old there. My mother, back then it was customary whenever you were baptized that you had a baptismal gown on, be it male or female, and that was me in my in my baptismal gown.
And this, I take it, is you and your father.
Yes, it is. That is a really rare picture. We don't there's not a lot of good pictures of my dad and I, but this is a good one that was taken. I'm going to guess circa 1952, 1950, 51, probably. We That was taken on the little farmette that we owned in Altoona and were raised on.
And this, I take it, is you as an altar boy.
Yeah, this is actually I'm in front. That was on my first Holy Communion. And once again, I would have been 6 years old then, so it would have been 1954. The one on the right, the taller of the two, is my brother Jim, and the one on the left is my brother Dominic. We Ironically, these are the three of us that are left out of all 10. There's all the rest have passed. So we're the only three there. And that brings tears to my eyes.
Yeah.
This is me in probably second or third grade. I know that you don't believe that all the guys that are out, or guys and gals that are out there, because that guy has red hair and I don't. But I back then I did have red hair and freckles.
Well, those are great photos. Always nice to kind of see the illustration of what it is
Sure.
that we're talking about. So I guess at this point, Mark, we can kind of jump ahead a little bit into the high school years.
Sure.
And I take it that it was pretty well right out of high school that you ended up going into the army.
Yeah, being a poor family like we were, there was really no chance whatsoever of going to college back then. I had a brother who lived in Detroit at the time, my brother John, who was the oldest brother. He invited me out there to live with him. So I transitioned right out of high school into the workaday world in 1967. I went to Detroit, Michigan, and I went to work for a company called Michigan Bell Telephone. Michigan Bell back then was the people that did all of the installation of all the phones. Believe it or not, guys, there used to be wires attached to all of our phones, and that was the only way that you could communicate with each other. And you had to pick up the phone. Sometimes it was a party line, sometimes it was a private line, depending on what your financial status was. But those would you could very easily understand that that was a different world back then. And I was caught up right at that point in time. Johnson, Kennedy had been assassinated. Johnson is now kind of starting to step up the war. Don't know that it was so much Johnson's idea as it was McNamara's. McNamara was, I think, the instigator. If you get a chance, a good read for anybody was um, the book on Johnson and McNamara called Dereliction of Duty. If you ever want a good read on the escalation of the war and who and what caused it, that's a good read. The only thing I'll say is, and it's not a spoiler alert, but McNamara just didn't listen to anybody on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as to what was going on in Vietnam and how to handle that war. All he knew is that he wanted to escalate it and keep it up and stop the domino effect from happening in Vietnam. So I got caught up in that. I was at a prime age. Part of that escalation was to take a look at anybody who turned 18 and a half in 1967, which, believe it or not, that was me. Um, Turned 18 and a half, had no children, and had no intention of going off to school. You will read in multiple places that they say that the bulk of the people that went to war in Vietnam weren't drafted, they enlisted. Believe me, most of the people in the field were drafted, and this is all part of that escalation. I think that in April of '68, when I went to Vietnam, there were more than 100,000 troops sent to Vietnam in that year. So I was in Detroit. I was drafted out of the Altoona draft board because I had registered there. Then I transferred out to Detroit. And then on October 24th of um, 1967, I got a note from, at that point, it was Richard Nixon. No, it wasn't Richard Nixon. It was Johnson, who said, we'd like you to report, and you're hereby reported to draft or to be drafted. So I was drafted on October 24th. I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, which was an armored division basic training school. First plane ride I ever had in my life was on an old Canadian plane from an Air Canada plane that flew out of Detroit down into Fort Knox, which I guess at that point they were probably landing in Lexington. But I can remember the fear that I had because as a young kid at 18 and a half, I had never flown before. And I ended up sitting just right next to the wing, and I could see the exhaust glowing red, and I just knew that the plane was going to go down. So, but that was my first experience at that. I spent I spent 8 weeks in basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Yes.
And sorry, Mark, I just wanted to get you to pause for a moment because I think you did include your draft notice, and I'll do a share screen right while we're on that topic, so the
Okay.
students can see a look at it. I also wanted to know, Mark, if you could explain to the students what we're looking at in this picture here.
Sure, that's the draft lottery. After Now, this is after I was drafted. This happened in the January after I was drafted. They decided that the only fair way to do this was to do it by lottery. Your birth date was assigned a number. I'm sorry, there were 365 numbers on a board, and your birth dates were all floating around in this giant lottery machine here, and they would pull them out, and whatever that they started on January 1st, or maybe they started on the other end. I wasn't available to see how they did this because I was in Vietnam at the time, but they would pull the birth date out, and the birth date would then go on to onto a board, and that's how you were assigned the priority by which you did that. If they pulled out November 13th as number one, that was the prime date of birth for you to be drafted. This is a DD 214. This is actually my discharge paper.
Oh, okay.
Um, and you probably want that at some point later, Scott.
I'll come back to that later. I'm pretty sure that you sent me your letter from the draft board as well.
Yes, I
Did you?
did.
Okay,
Mhm.
I have that in there. I'll go and locate that in just a moment. But
Well, JD, there's two things that come to mind as somebody asked me that question, and that's a very thought-provoking question for me. My dad was very proud. My dad was a proud Italian guy that he was actually born in Italy, and he served. And there was no doubt in my mind whatsoever. There were people that were evading the draft, going to Canada and going to other parts of the world so that they wouldn't be drafted. I knew in my heart that I would be drafted and I would serve this country, and I knew that. And my dad was very proud of that fact. My mother was a totally different story. My mother was this very gentle person who was very emotional. Um, I will, I promise you all that I am this very emotional Italian myself. I'll try not to cry, but if I tear up, I apologize way ahead of time. Sometimes that happens. My mother actually said to me on the day that I was leaving for Vietnam, "This will be the last day I ever see you." She said, "I know that you won't make it back." Um, and I never held that against my mother. I know that in her mind she thought that she thought, well, this is it, because all you saw on the news was the death and destruction that was happening in Vietnam, and that was on that little black and white TV that we had for so long, and that was all. And Walter Cronkite, Vietnam was the first war that became broadcast, and I think that was part of what the dissension was. So my mother and dad didn't. Now I had a brother, my brother Nick, who was in the Air Force and the Army at different times, wanted to. He said he would volunteer to go there, but the Air Force at that point wouldn't let him go because he had already served a tour there, and they wouldn't allow him to go back and do a second term, only because of his MOS there. So it was a very it was an enlightening experience for me. I think the story about my dad as I come back is more moving than whenever I left. But he was very proud of me and said, "Go do your job, do what needs to be done, and come back soon, safe," is what his advice was to me.
And I did find that notice. Let me do a quick share screen there so the students can
Okay.
see what a draft notice looks like. So, I mean, obviously, Mark, you were expecting this, and students, you can see the date, September 20th, 67 and so forth. How did you feel when, your time came, so to speak?
Well, it was an oh crap moment for me, to be very, very blunt and honest with you. I mean, I knew it was coming. I'd like to say that I was very aware of where I was, but Scott, I was, not much older than your students are here. I mean, I was 18 and a half. I was just transitioning between high school and when they would normally go to college. So yes, it was very expected, but it still was one of those gulp. I guess that this is real. And even at this point, I shoved aside and said, well, maybe I can join, maybe I can get into Warrant Officer Flight School, maybe I can do all of that. But everybody now was making a mad rush when this was issued, and they were trying to get into the reserves, trying to get into the Army, the Air Force. So there was, as they talk about, all of the enlisted people that served, they were people that were trying to get around being what I became, an infantryman in Vietnam. So that's why most of them, we'll chat a bit about it later, but most people um, in Vietnam were not combat people. I believe it sometimes that percentage of people in Vietnam that saw actual combat is somewhere between 12 and 15%, depending. All the rest of the people were support people. Um, Now, when I talk about 12 to 15%, it's whether you're including artillerymen and pilots and those types of people. So there were a lot of people that were trying to get around going and being drafted. Uh, I belong to a lot of various different veterans groups. I would like to have a nickel for every time somebody said, I joined so I wouldn't be drafted. So because when you got drafted, it was you no longer controlled your fate.
That's very well said. And the students would be a little young to remember, but this is a big thing that comes up in elections. And, President Trump, President Bush, President Clinton are, three names that immediately come to mind of men who, found different ways of avoiding the
And
draft.
and Bush, I mean, young Bush ended up in the Texas National Guard. And that's all good duty. I'm not demeaning that or saying anything bad about that. So I was first off, yes, I was happy in the Army. I need to, preface everything with that. The Army, Evan, gave me a very good set of discipline. I was young and foolish, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do in life, and the Army helped me get that. So just so you know that I did enjoy what I learned there and how I learned it. My first station, well, it was Fort Knox, Kentucky. And then I left Fort Knox after basic and I went to Fort Polk, Louisiana. And that was a sign there. I can vividly remember that. And I think that Mr. Masters has a picture of it. That was called the home, Tigerland, the home of the combat veteran for Vietnam, combat infantryman for Vietnam. And so that was the second spot that I was assigned to. Um, I think that, yeah, there it is, Tigerland. That's me as a very young guy and a very thin guy at that point. Uh, Way back when, yeah, that this was taken, that one was probably taken whenever I was in basic training. And as I came out of basic training, I went to the other there. This is just some stock pictures of how they used to give us haircuts and just used to pull our hair. You never had, you couldn't say take just a little off the top. They took a little off of everywhere. But I went to Fort Polk. It was in Leesville, Louisiana, which is west of New Orleans and east of a little town called Jasper, Texas. We spent a lot of time learning how to survive in the wilderness and in the jungle. That was as close as we could get to jungle in the United States and some of the swamps around Fort Polk. You learned how to survive. You learned how to shoot weapons. You learned how to use grenades. You learned how to, just be an infantryman inside and out. So I left there, and then the first true assignment I had. Now you have to understand this all happened between the end of October of '67 and the very end of March of '68, because by April 3rd or April 4th of 1968, I was in Vietnam. So my first duty assignment that wasn't training was in Vietnam.
And I'm going to do another quick screen share because there's a few other photos from this era that I think are interesting for the students to see. Now, is this here you
That
here?
is me, yes. And that would have been in basic training. We were standing for inspection, and that particular one is in at Fort Polk, Louisiana. That was me. And children, you see that cigarette, never, ever, ever, ever pick one of those up. Because in 1980, I finally realized that was the worst thing I could do to myself.
And what this picture with up here, who the guy who's looking at the camera, is there? I just sort of struck me in the photo how the one guy's paying attention to the camera.
Well, that's one of the very few people that I know you have a question in here a little later about friends, but I remember Steve Seabrook is who this is. We were standing inspection back in basic training. Used to be that you would do this until, the ultimate outcome of basic training is a lot of mind control. You need to think like a soldier, you need to act like a soldier, you need to be a soldier. So what they would do with us is they would stand us there at the end of our bunks, and that's where we were. And we were standing for Inspector General. The IG would come through, and he would do an inspection of not only us, our beds, our foot locker where you kept the world that you owned, and that was everything that they issued to you. One of the things that I always kind of laugh about is they would actually take a quarter out of their pocket and drop it on your bed. And if that did not bounce, you failed the inspection. You needed to have everything pulled so tight that they would that would happen. So,
So that's not just a thing that's in the movies. That really
oh no,
happens.
no, that actually happened. Yes.
So tell nowadays, do you still make your bed like that, Mark?
No, but my wife and I kind of we do well. We make sure it's good and tight, but the quarters don't bounce anymore. And today's bed is a lot different than that bed. There were several units that I was attached to, but I'm assuming that you mean in Vietnam is what I'm going to take that. I was with the First Cavalry Division. Not only was I with the First Cavalry Division, I was with A Company of the First Battalion of the Seventh Cavalry, which is Gary Owens. I'll give you just a brief history lesson as we go here. I am so proud of being a member of the Seventh Cavalry because of all the people in the world that was the first commanding officer of the Seventh Cavalry. Does anybody have any idea who that was? The very first one? Probably not. But it was George Armstrong Custer. And George Custer is remembered for what? Can anybody answer that? That was the worst day of his life. He was
Think back.
killed at, go ahead.
I was going to think back, students, for those of you who have taken American history, really infamous battle fought by a river. Go ahead, Mark.
It was the Battle of the Little Bighorn in the middle of Wyoming. He died there by going down in and saying, let's just wipe up this kind of little bit of these American Indians at the time, First Nation there, and they absolutely wiped out the entire Custer crew. But nobody realizes that was the worst day of his life. The best day of his life, and I will stop my history lesson at this, was on July 3rd, 1863, in a little town west of where I live here called Gettysburg. He was on the Eastern Cavalry Field at the Battle of Gettysburg, where he actually defeated Jeb Stuart, who was the cavalryman of that era, and Armstrong at age 23 was a general. He was there's a whole history I could give you on him, but I won't do that. He ended up at Gettysburg being the first person to ever use a repeating rifle. And that repeating rifle was made by a company out of Connecticut called Spencer's. And whenever he did that, he ended up winning the battle or stopping Jeb Stuart from penetrating the backside of Meade. And otherwise, we in Pennsylvania might be eating grits and saluting the Confederate flag today if it hadn't been for Custer. And I was in that unit that he had served as the first. Boy, that's a long way to get around to answering a question, but the first battle or the first company and unit I was assigned to. Sorry
And
about that.
oh, that's okay. And students, you guys can see some signs of this on Mark's shirt. He's wearing the symbol of
Yes.
the Seventh Cav, and you can also see it in the background image there, the frame. And there's kind of an important question. The students might be thinking about this, Mark, but when we think of cavalry, we think of soldiers fighting on horseback, of course. No soldiers on horseback in Vietnam. So, Mark, what takes the place of the horses?
We had an iron horse. Ours was a flying bird. We were air mobile. The First Cavalry Division was deployed to Vietnam in September of 1965 as a unit. Went over and landed in the Da Nang area, which is the I Corps area. They were then. This is very much one of the. This is A Company of the First Battalion, the Seventh Cavalry. This is one of our units. This was probably in the I Drang Valley unit, but they landed there. The North Vietnamese at the time were in the I Drang Valley. I Drang is Vietnamese for river. It's a river valley in the I Corps. And they were not the Viet Cong and the NVA, which was the North Vietnamese Army, wanted to test what kind of war they were going to have to fight here. So the Battle of Ai Drang, which is a book which you need to, if once again, another great read on Vietnam, and very, very true to life and very factual. I think that it was also called We Were All Soldiers Once and Young. We were young once and soldiers, or something to that effect. But the North Vietnamese had a stronghold on the valley there, and they tested the mettle of what the First Cavalry Division was and who they were. And what we did is everything was air assault. We found that doing, that this is all very much me. That's me on the right. And the one on the left just shows what the combat assault looked like. A combat assault, we called them Charlie Alphas, is those helicopters would be loaded with 8 to 10 troops, fully engaged and ready for battle. I'm going to guess that the guy on the ground was part of an earlier insertion that went out and laid down a blanket of fire and made the landing zone safe. So the first cav would travel like that. We were resupplied by that in that manner. They probably at some point had about 2,500 helicopters assigned to the First Cavalry Division in Vietnam. So that was the unit I was assigned to. Now, the Ai Drang Valley and all of that battle happened prior to me getting there. This happened in 65, 66. I got there early 68. And one of the things that we did, my very first combat assault was into a place called Asia Valley. In the latter part of the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese had mounted a massive offensive during Tet, which is the Chinese New Year, which happens usually in late February. I'm not exactly how the numbers work out, but we went into Asia Valley with an operation called Operation Delaware. We did that mostly with the First Cav, but in conjunction with a few people from the 101st Airborne Division. Scott, have I gone too far?
That's good. I did have one little question there. The photo I showed of you a moment ago, you weren't wearing glasses. So did you, what was your vision like at that time? In all your training photos, you did have them on.
Well, I usually took them off because they were these big round Oglethorpe glasses. To be honest with you, these glasses are a white cane with a red tip, Scott. I mean, I can't see a whole lot without them. And at some points too, I think that photo that you saw is whenever I was coming back from being in Camp Zama, Japan, which I'll talk about later. And I think that my glasses were lost in that, and we were waiting for new ones.
I mean, that's a thing that always struck me. I mean, I wear glasses myself, and I would just imagine the difficulty of having to wear glasses in a combat situation. I mean, that would just be one extra layer of stress.
Yeah, and it is, believe me. And then they were always, when you did have them, they were always dirty because you were sweating and mud everywhere, and just not very easy to do. So.
When exactly did you get shipped over to Vietnam?
I left Fort Lewis, Washington on April 4th of 1968. Flew to Anchorage, Alaska, to Tokyo, Japan, to Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam. And that brown uniform that I was in at Tigerland is what I flew into Vietnam with. I thought to myself, I don't have a weapon. I don't have any combat gear, and I'm landing here. Of course, we're on a big jet. We're at a secure airport, but I'm just not young, naive kid that doesn't have any idea of what lies in store for me. And so, yeah, that was the date. The ironic part of the date is April 4th, 1968, if you look it up, is when Ho Chi Minh decided to go to the peace tables in Paris and begin the talks. And I like to think that because he knew I was there and I was bad, that he decided I better end this thing as quickly as possible. Of course, it never did, but I like to think that once again, it was also the day that Robert Kennedy was assassinated. No, I'm sorry, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Not Kennedy. I'm sorry. I apologize for
And those are really important big ideas to connect to, because students who have taken American history, you guys remember, I hope, that 1968 was such a tumultuous year for so many different reasons. I'll do another quick screen share here, Marcus. There's two other great photos you had that I think sort of illustrate you getting ready to go over, and
that.
the reality of what life is like on the ground in Vietnam.
Yeah, the one on the left, I was the day that I left Altoona, Pennsylvania, because I was on leave and I had gone to Altoona to visit my parents. I was flying back to Detroit because my origin flights for Vietnam actually started out of Detroit because that's where I was living. So that was me back there with you could see all the brave hardware that I have on me, the red and yellow ribbon above my left breast. In the picture there is a national defense. That was the only medal I had. The other two smaller medals are uh, weapon qualification. Um, and the one on the right was a little bit later after I had been wounded in Vietnam. And I came back from Camp Zama, Japan, and they gave me some duty there that was lighter duty, and I didn't have to go back out in the field right away. While I had some contact with them, I mean, it was mostly they were very dedicated and thankful people that we were there. They would greet us. They treated us with respect when you went through a village that was there. In the I Corps, we primarily did a lot of mountain yard villages. They were small, kind of small villages that were farming and rice paddy areas and things like that. But I do remember that. I remember vividly too. And I researched it a bit. I can remember the Stars and Stripes, which was a military newspaper that in 1968 had a picture of a young Vietnamese girl running from a napalm strike that they had claimed that the Americans had called in on this village and were burning them up. And actually, as I looked that up and found out that it was more of a myth because it was an, a Vietnamese Air Force plane that dropped that napalm that day and was called in by accident with them. But they made it seem as if it was the atrocious American um, you know um, bombing at will and all of that too. But I really, I felt sorry for the Vietnamese people because they had been at war for so long, Luke, that they really they really didn't know in a lifetime a world without war. And we Americans, I put up with it for a year, and I was devastated by it and never would want to wish that upon anybody, but I don't know how you would put up with it for an entire generation or two.
And I'll do a quick photo share on the photo on the image you just described, Mark. Some of the students are going to recognize it; they've seen it
Okay.
before. And for students who don't, this is it's a really shocking photo. It's a very famous photo from the war that I think Mark described very aptly. The young woman, Mark, in case you don't know, her name is Kim Fook. She actually lives just outside Toronto. I've spoke
Oh,
I've spoken with her on the phone a couple of times. I've really been trying to get her to do some sort of Zoom or appearance at the school, but she's a pretty well-known peace activist later in her life. And students, if you're wondering why she's naked, her village, Mark described it, was bombed with this substance called napalm. It's a jelly-like substance that basically burns everything. And she effectively had the clothes burned off her back, and she's got very, very serious burns. But for students who took American history last year, you guys remember what a significant impact this photo had. Really, really dramatic moment as far as the war is concerned. And During your time in Vietnam, Mark, there were other images like this that came out. Did you have a sense of, how the war was being presented back home?
None whatsoever. I mean, only what I got, Scott, from my dad. Because it was actually pretty well censored. I mean, as far as what was going on in the home front. Now, I mean, we had the Armed Forces Vietnam Network, which was a radio station, and they, Good Morning Vietnam. Everybody knows that, but it wasn't quite that good and that nice. And as a matter of fact, Pat Sajak was one of those DJs that did those in Vietnam. But anyways, you didn't get a real good sense for it. My dad would send copies of the El Tuna Mirror to me, which was the newspaper from El Tuna, and I would see that, but I didn't know, I didn't have a real good sense for the anti-war sentiment that was building in America. And I often think to myself that this was all done, thanks to the media. The media and the way that they presented it, it just kept escalating the anti-war sentiment, and the more that that seemed to happen, the more that McNamara and Johnson seemed to want to push this off on the side and act like nothing was really happening. So,
I wanted to ask about that because you mentioned seeing that photograph in Stars and Stripes. And students,
yeah,
if you don't know, Stars and Stripes is a newspaper of the American Armed Forces. Kind of
yeah.
surprised me that they would use that image.
Now that I say to think of it, it might have been in the Ultimate Mirror. I know I saw that in Vietnam, and now that you say that, I think you're right. I think it was in the Ultimate Mirror that my dad had sent that to me and said, "Is any of this familiar?" And that to me, that was one of those moments that you just have that change your perspective on everything. I mean, that I grew up very quickly knowing that was why I wanted to see why we as Americans would do such a horrible thing to such a village, and come to find out later in life that it wasn't us. It very well could have been us, but in this one case it wasn't. Let's see, there are several things that I yes, I got letters frequently, Noah, and they were. I was married. That marriage, we'll talk about that later, dissolved whenever I came back from Vietnam. But I did get letters from them. I did get letters from my brothers and sisters. One of the advantages of being in Vietnam is there was no postage for me on outgoing mail, so I just wrote free across there. But I can remember waiting and anticipating mail call like a kid waiting for Christmas, because that was the touch back home. That was what put you back in the United States, in the world is what we called it back then. And packages came and they would have various different, canned foods and things, because uh, Vietnam, or the food that we had in Vietnam was mostly sea rations. It was before MREs, because MREs are pretty well are good food compared to what we had back then. But I used to get Italian cookies and salamis and things that would keep. And we would wait for them for Christmas, or like it was Christmas, and trying to get them. As Mr. Masters could tell you, we just had the Vietnam Breakfast Club, Veterans Breakfast Club, just did a series, or one of the shows on the military affiliated radio system, the Mars system. And that was how you got to make a call, if at all. And it was actually, it wasn't a call, it was a shortwave radio transmission that you would be able to call home with. I can remember my dad called and wanting to know if I had survived the wounds and things like that, that I hadn't had a chance to. There was a telegram sent to him, and communication was lost. But he and I talked over what was called that Mars system. So that was the only telephone. Everybody today has a cell phone that you're so used to kind of communication, on demand. Back then, it wasn't that way.
That's important to know. In students, you would see an evolution here. We've spoken to a lot of World War II vets who talked about the importance of mail call. Vietnam phone calls and voice communications do become possible, but they certainly were not easy.
Right.
So, Mark, I do have a couple of other photos maybe we can look at. And
Sure.
question number 12, I put in sort of a general way. I know that you don't want to talk about the mud and the blood of the
Sure.
battlefield, so to speak, but I'd love it if you could give the kids some sense of what the battlefield looked like for you.
Sure. And I'll gladly do that. I mean, I don't want to go into the gore. What happens is I just have a tough time going through it, and I will gladly do that. So you have to bear with me as I do this. April 19th, 1968, Ashaw Valley. I'm 18 and a half years old. I'm not 19 yet. I am doing my first combat assault. My first combat assault, which is going into Ashaw Valley. Ashaw Valley was a stronghold of the North Vietnamese that the 101st and the Marine Corps had taken during a battle earlier. That was part of the frustration in Vietnam, that you would battle to take ground and then cede it up, give it up, not really retain that ground, just fight the battle for the sake of fighting the battle. Ashaw Valley was a valley that runs north-south in the I-Corps area. I was in my first helicopter experience. I'd gone through all of the training that they do in country and been assigned to my unit. And as we went into Ashaw Valley, the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, they held the western slope of this valley. The eastern slope was held by the United States, or by the Allied forces. And in the center of the valley was an airstrip. And we were, our challenge, this was Operation Delaware. If you want to look that up, and there's a couple of really good stories on it and maps of that out online. We went in on a helicopter, and we were the first ones in to set up the perimeter that is there. As we went in, there was anti-aircraft fire, big guns on the valley floor. They were taking Hueys. Now the helicopters were primarily going in. There were UH-1 troop transports, the one that you see all of the people going in on. And we were going into Ashaw, and the anti-aircraft was so heavy and the small arms fire was so heavy that the helicopter pilots and door gunners wanted to get out of there as quick as they could. So they were pushing people out of the helicopters. There were some broken legs involved in that, but as we were going down, I saw my first person that ever died. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pretty, but I said that battlefield prayer that everybody says: "Dear God, please get me through this. Please, I promise that I will do everything that I possibly can in order to serve you." And I said that prayer as I went out, and evidently it was heard, because I survived a year of that. And we eventually took that valley back, but at a very, very steep cost. A bunch of helicopters down. Actually, a C-130 was shot down while trying to resupply us coming into that airstrip on the valley floor. I think there's an article out there that a guy from Detroit wrote, a reporter, that he was to be on that plane and came in on the second plane, and it did land on the valley floor. We did secure all of Ashaw again, but that battle raged from April 19th until 3/4 of the way through May. So that's the battlefield experience that I remember. I remember I shut that all out. You know, a veteran never leaves a war. I fight that every every day, knowing that I made that promise, and I am trying to fulfill that promise every day in the way I live and what I do.
That's a really nice way of putting it, especially as we're coming up to Veterans Day in the United States, Remembrance Day in Canada. I'll
Mhm.
do another screen share just to
Okay.
show the students some about some of what you were speaking about there. Students, you heard him mention some of the different kinds of helicopters, and I think I have one of the Hue. Oh, that's a different one. I thought I had one of the Hueys. There it
That's
is.
a Huey there, yes. And that's one that was assigned or attached to the first Cav division. That was one that we were going out on. I think if you look at it, it's probably, I think it's August of '68 is when I took that.
And these
That one
ones
is
here.
that's a Chinook. That that is one that was uh, made for larger transport. It could transport up to, I'm going to guess a platoon. So you could get a bunch of troops in the inside. Also, a very versatile helicopter. Uh, shouldn't fly. The blades turn in opposite directions, and it's a really powerful helicopter that is still being used to this very day in the Army and Air Corps or Air Force.
And once you were put on the ground, I think I understood that you would often be down for maybe 2, 3 weeks at a time for a
Well,
mission.
yeah, 2 weeks it would be a long time to be out, but yeah, and then we were brought back. Get they would bring in on a Chinook or on a Huey, whatever it was, food and things like that, so that we had food, and every once in a while, clean clothing and medical supplies and letters from home. But yeah, we would stay out in the field anywhere from a week to 3 weeks. I think is the shortest and longest of it. Then we'd come back in and do it was called stand down, where they would bring you into like LZ Jack or Camp Evans. These were big posts for the Cav, and you would set up a perimeter and pull perimeter guard, get a haircut. Even though you were in Vietnam, they were still stringent about keeping the hair off the ears, no beards or anything like that. You won't see any beard. You could see a mustache or two. I think that I have a couple that have a mustache, but this is a typical patrol going through an orchard there that was in one of the valleys. And um, actually this was in a column. We would also do rice paddies where we would fan across the paddies and do that. And that's actually where and how I was wounded, was in a rice paddy, not in this particular type of column. But as you look at this, we often had either a chuhoi, which means I surrender. They would surrender, and we would use them to walk point. As you, Scott, if you look at the very top of that picture out front, yeah, out in there is what you call point. And we would end up using Chuhois or Arvins that knew the areas pretty well to walk that point. And number one, number two, they were more aware of booby traps and landmines than we were. They had a better sense of them. So, and 9 times out of 10, we would have Chuhoi or an Arvin out there in front. But I also did walk point a couple of times while I was there. So it's not you have to be extra perceptive about your surroundings and know where you are and what you're doing, and constantly be watching not just the ground in front of you, but the ground off to 45 degrees out either side. Yes, I was, and that happened on August 26th of 1968. We were doing what I just said, Kyle, working across in a formation across the rice paddy where we were sweeping the paddy. It was a platoon size group of 30 to 40 people. I was on the extreme left side of that column, and there was an NVA or a Viet Cong, whichever it was, I didn't know, on the far right side of it, or off to that far right side. And he fired a rocket trying to hit, yeah, this is the type of sweep it was. He fired a rocket trying to hit that column, and he was a bad shot. Um, so he went the whole way over that. With me being on the extreme left side of that, the rocket, a B-40 rocket, ended up landing about 20 feet from, or no, 20 yards from me. Now they blow up and out in this direction. I was peppered with shrapnel up and down my left side. They picked that out, and I ended up going to Camp Zama, Japan. Well, actually, I went to LZ Evans, where they treated me quickly, assessed the wounds, took me then to Camp Cameron Bay. I got on a plane in Cameron Bay that was a C-141 Stratolifter Air Force plane, and they actually had little compartments like pods where they could just put the whole bed, and the nurses and doctors would walk up and down the center of that plane and treat people on either side that needed it. There were people that were far worse wounded than I was. I ended up getting into Camp Zama, picking all the shrapnel out, and then going back to Vietnam. I was awarded Purple Heart for that. So.
And for students who don't know that medal, Purple Heart is, well, why don't you tell them, Mark, what is a Purple Heart?
It is an award that is given only to people that are wounded in battle. You have to be wounded in battle. You can't fall down and trip in your ankle at the NCO club and get a Purple Heart. And that was initiated by George Washington way back during the Revolutionary War, and actually it was brought back, I believe, during more predominantly during World War II, and began being issued. So yes. Good question, James, and a good way to state it. There were lots of all of the doctors and nurses. Now we had medics. Number one, whenever I was wounded, they came in and they compressed the wounds and did all of that. They tied these on to me, got the bleeding, the major bleeding stopped. Then you went to what was called a triage center, where they would determine whether or not you were ambulatory, or whether you were alive, or actually, yeah, whether you survived your wounds or not. You would then go to a major hospital center, which in my case, I went to LZ Evans. LZ Evans had a trauma center there. They treated us up, decided where you were going to go. And then in Cameron Bay, there was a larger hospital there. They would once again assess you, see what could be done with you, and prepare you. There were two different paths you could take. At that point, you could go either home, or there was a hospital in Camp Zama, Japan. There was one in Guam, I believe. So they were all over the place, and it was they were very caring, sincere, loving people that, I still remember one of the nurses, and this is 53 years ago, laying a hand on my shoulder saying, "You're going to be all right. We want you to know that." And that was one of the most reassuring things that I had heard, because, my entire side of my body was black and blue from the concussion of that rocket. Number one. Number two, today I suffered deafness in this ear because of that. I have no hearing here at all. And actually it's getting even worse than that. I'm starting to lose it in my right ear. So yes, they were very kind and very caring people.
That's good to know. Mark, there was one photo I wanted to ask you about, and it sort of relates, I think, perhaps to question number 14, which I know is a tough question to ask and to answer, about losing friends in a situation like this. But there was one photo that you included, and I don't know if this is a good friend or somebody you lost, but I'll do a share screen here, and you can maybe let us know. Who's the man here?
This was Lieutenant Figueroa. he was the platoon leader for my platoon. No, he survived. He was a great guy. I've often This is one of the very few people. There's a question in here about friends. I while I met a lot of people there, you have to understand the dynamic that was happening here. In Vietnam, when you went over there, I talked about the first cab going over as a unit, but it was pretty much individuals. You went over as an individual, you spent a year there. When our fathers and grandfathers went to war, they went as a unit and you knew the people that were beside you that whole time. In Vietnam, it was like a flash in the pan. It was a year-long uh, battle for survival. I mean, you needed to survive. So while I knew people and while people were there, the turnover rate of wounded and killed and just normal rotation in and out was so fast and so furious that you really didn't make a lot of good friends. But I do remember Lieutenant Figueroa. I mean, he and then Scott, there's a picture of me with four guys in a CIB. Do you happen to, if you can find that, that would be very appropriate for this question. Yeah, that would, okay. The combat infantryman's badge is awarded only to 11 Bs. 11 Bravo is an military occupational specialty, MOS. 11B is infantry, light weapons infantry. This badge that you see here, and you will also see on my uniforms, is called the Combat Infantryman's Badge. The four of us, were awarded that together. We had come back. You can see I'm in the right in jungle fatigues with those big horny glasses on, Scott, as you can see there. But the guy that is second from the left is a guy named Benny Winger. Benny didn't make it. He didn't get back. And I treasure this picture that's here because of him. The other two guys, I don't remember their names, but I remember Benny. So he was from South Carolina. He was a tremendous person, and about the same age as I. A lot of people often mistake us for brothers because we looked alike. So he was a great guy.
And just to be clear, is it the guy in the white T-shirt here, Mark,
Yes.
or the?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm looking at the correct one. And students, Mark just mentioned another really important concept, and it's something that you guys know from a totally different context. Tour of Duty. For the students, Tour of Duty is a video game. A couple of them have probably played, I'm going to guess. But relative to Vietnam, Tour of Duty was the phrase that was used for that 1 year system that Mark is talking about. So you would get that kind of strange turnover as a result of that. And part of that, Mark, and students, you won't know this phrase, it's spelled DEROS. What was your DEROS?
My DEROS was April 3rd of 1969. That was date estimated rotation overseas. So I knew that, my report to duty was the 4th. So we counted the days down. We had short timers calendars. We had little sayings that, when we talk about short timer, we had a short time in country. I would talk about being so short that I could sit on a dime and dangle my legs over the edge of a dime. And there was all kind of little sayings that we made about that. But you very much look forward to that rotation back, the date rotation back to the United States. I ended up living for a year on beans and franks. We used to take Claymore mines, which was a mine that uh, was anti-personnel. It was a round circular mine that we used for perimeter defense, and you would run it out. And there was a detonator that you had that you could blow it up, and it blew away from you, so you were safe on the backside. But inside that was some plastic explosive, and it was called C4. And C4 was just like, as long as you, yeah, that's a claymore. And if you have to have that front towards the enemy on there, you're not very intelligent. I don't guess you're going to be a brain surgeon if you have that. But inside that is some, the detonator is closest to me on the right. The mine is on the back, and the wire that you ran out is there that helped set it up. But anyways, I used to heat up everything in my canteen cup, and I would take a small piece of that C4, and it would just burn so hot and so fast. As long as you didn't have pressure with it, it would not blow up, and it would just burn hot. The minute you would have any pressure with it, it would blow up. We had a guy throw a piece of it into a fire one time, not thinking, because it was all covered with dirt and debris. And when he did, he threw it in, and it came up and it blew up. And a lieutenant got caught in the neck with a piece of the shrapnel from it that it blew it up. But this is a canteen. This is a basic mess that you have here. There's a canteen, and within the sea ration, which it was all contained in that box just behind the spoon. You would get, I always called it mystery meat. You didn't know what it was. It was a spam-like substance that you could make and heat up. And then there were, I think you would give your right arm for peaches and Melba toast that came so that you could have some good dessert. But I survived on what I think was beans and franks for an entire year over there. I mean, but there was always nutrition there, Kate. It was the sea rations weren't everyday meals. I mean, we ate them when we were stranded or couldn't get supplies in. Under normal circumstances, we were fortunate with the First Cavalry Division. They would try to get us one hot meal a day if it's breakfast or supper, and they would bring that out in the helicopter. And they had these huge insulated discs or containers that are like a thermos, and they would have you know some kind of slop or food in there that they would call that we called slop. That was the word mess was always there, but no, it didn't affect us. We always had enough to keep us going and keep us surviving. I've got to guess that there were a few times that there were a few troops that were isolated so badly that they didn't get food in time and things like that. But I don't think, as a general rule, that happened. Well, I think I was wet for an entire year, Jada. If it wasn't wet from the rains and the monsoons, you were wet from perspiration and naturally, you get jungle rot in your feet because your feet are inside boots and the boots are wet and there's sweating going on and things like that. There were some people that got it so badly that they had to actually be medevaced out in order to do that. But the rains, they would come during the monsoons like clockwork at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the ironic part of it is, I guess I think about this more now. It seemed so cold at times there because you were used to high humidity and such hot weather that during the day that you got so hot and then the rains came in, or a typhoon. We did survive. I was in a typhoon while we were there, very much like a typhoon is just the opposite of a hurricane, opposite turning of the wind. During the typhoon, when it would rain, I would shiver because and it may be 75 degrees, but you're so used to 90 and 100 degrees weather that the blood tends to thin out and things like that. So you would, not be used to the colder weather. So
So
you
let me
guys in
ask.
Toronto, no colder weather.
Yeah, let me ask a follow up based on the humidity and the heat and everything. Water. How much water would you carry with you at a given time?
I generally carried two canteens, and they would bring a bladder out of potable water. So I would try to, depending on the day, I would try to keep as much water in me as I possibly could. Um, the water that you came across on the grounds there um, was not drinkable. So you had to have, they also gave us salt tablets to put in there that would purify it, or water purification tablets. So if you did come across a mountain stream that you knew was fed, you would do that. But usually the streams in the valleys were more used for um, sanitary sewers, more than they were for anything else. I did develop malaria while I was there. Um, and I can vividly remember not having enough water when I was suffering from malaria. Ended up at a it in Da Nang at a hospital for that too.
And in terms of the battlefield kind of experience, Mark, are there any other individual stories that come to your mind that you would be willing to share with the students? And they don't have to be combat necessarily, but just,
Yeah,
things that sort of get to the heart of what it was like.
well, yeah, and I mean it was the downtime. The waiting sometimes was worse than the battle time, because it seemed like you would trudge through the jungle, and the point man sometimes would have to have a machete and cut his way, where we would wait until they could move. You may only move a half a mile a day, depending on how thick the jungle was. And I can just remember being so weary, so tired, because you had 100 pound. Well, 100 pound is a little exaggeration. I'm going to guess a 50 to 60 pounds of supplies, depending on what you're doing. You got to have an air mattress. You got to sleep at night. You got to have a half a poncho so that you could cover, make a pop tent. You had to have an entrenching tool. If you're a radio man, you had to carry the radio. You had to have ammunition. You had to have grenades. You had to have all of the necessary essentials, and they were on your back. Um, those are vivid. I can remember being so tired. I can remember being an RTO, radio telegraph operator, the radio operator that would keep you in communication um, with the rest of either the company or the platoon or whatever size unit you were working with. And I can remember carrying that, and I'm going to guess a PR-25 back then. If my memory serves me right, that added 25 or 30 pounds to an already heavy backpack that you were carrying. That not only that, depending on where you were going and how the supplies were going to be, carrying some extra water, carrying food with you, and things like that. So, there wasn't a whole lot to do. I mean, you one of my prized possessions was a transistor radio. These were very small, very compact radios that a 9-volt battery ran, and you listened a lot uh, to the radio, and that was Armed Forces Vietnam Network, AFVN. Um, and that whenever you were in a safe area, like at an LZ or at a camp, we would spend time at the enlisted men's club, um, uh, you know, um, the NCO club, and they would bring entertainment in for that. But there wasn't a lot of downtime. People talk about, and dare I talk about it, that there was a high amount of marijuana usage and things like that in Vietnam. I never experienced that the entire time I was there. I guess I was either naive or just too concerned with being alert for me and the people that I am protecting and those people I'm around. Um, I was always uber aware of them and what my responsibility was. It's a That's why they limited it to, for the enlisted men, it was a year. For officers who were in charge, it actually ended up being more of like a 6-month tour is all they would have to do. That tent behind me was one of those little tents. You usually had a 2-man tent. You took 2 ponchos and put them together, and it would let 2 air mattresses sleep together. That's me 53 years ago and probably 60 or 70 pounds ago. On the left and on the right, that had, you can see the entrenching tool hanging off my pack. Some of the stuff you see there, I'm sure I was just light that day too.
Those are great photos, and they really do help to tell the story. I always tell students that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and especially when you're looking back at your own life. Now, I had one question on here that probably strikes the students as a little bit strange, but it's kind of an interesting one that often provokes discussion. What about big holidays like Christmas? How was that kind of thing handled in Vietnam?
I can remember, ceasefires during Christmas. And we ceasefire had a ceasefire during 10. That was one of the things that caught us so by surprise back then. But it wasn't anything special. I think that my birthday in 1968, when I turned 20 years old, I was in Asia Valley. Um, didn't even realize that my birthday had came and went at that point. But you think about turning 20 in a battlefield like that. And I turned 20 in May. I came back to Pennsylvania. Um, I was still 20 years old, not old enough to vote, and not old enough to have a beer legally in the state of Pennsylvania.
And I should highlight that students, you guys are accustomed to 18 being the voting age now. At this time in the United States, it was 21. I think they ended up lowering that. Was it in the mid 1970s or so?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And now we're having, of course, this debate about lowering it to 16. At least we're having that discussion a little bit in Canada. Now, there's another phrase that comes up right after this on the question sheet. Some of the students would know this. They actually had a chance to meet one or two last year. But did you ever have encounters with donut dollies?
Well, anytime that Bob Hope was in country, donut dollies were everywhere. And yes, you would see that they would sometimes get on helicopters, come out to a safe LZ. They would not come into a hot LZ, but they'd come into a secure, safe LZ. And yes, they would bring donuts that were probably as old as some of the donut dollies that brought them out there. Yes, and it was a welcome sight. It we affectionately like to see American women only because they were always such beauties to us, and it reminded us so much of home. And so yes, we were glad that.
And that was an interesting part of the wartime experience. A couple of the students would remember, I guess James especially, because he was in the American history class. We did have a class where a Vietnam vet and a donut dolly came in and did a presentation together, and it
Ah,
was really, really quite fascinating to see what the conversation was like there. Um,
there were lots of news crews in there, but it was nothing that my family could specifically look at with me. The closest now back then, broadcasting like we're doing here today was Jetson mentality. You guys don't know who the Jetsons are, do you? Uh, was Jetson mentality that it was so far into the future that we would never have realized this. The only thing that we used was cassette tapes a lot, where we would send cassette tapes back and forth if you, in fact, were in a position where you could have a cassette recorder. People in the field didn't want to add, combat men didn't want to add that extra weight. So the primary means of communication that we had back and forth was just letters and newspaper clippings.
You mentioned the cassette tape thing, and I don't know if students even know what cassettes are now, but it's not so long ago. But the recorders were, fairly sizable. I mean, you know, they would take up some space. But were you able to receive cassette tapes like with music or anything like that?
I mean, no, only because yeah, there were people that if you were lucky enough to be in a rear camp or something like that, yes, then you could even have reel to reel. A lot of that happened back then, but cassettes were relatively new back then. I mean, now you got to remember this was prior to 8 tracks and things like that, so most of it was done on reel to reel. But I'm going to guess that you could probably have bought a cassette tape back then, but it would have been more expensive than a reel to reel. So.
Students, I think one of the themes for you guys to very much be aware of is just that technology back then, everything was a lot bigger, and
Oh,
it was just impractical for a soldier to have some of this stuff in the battlefield. Now, I want to kind of, I guess, transition away from Vietnam a little bit and kind of get into some of the home front type topics. Is there anything else, Mark, that you can think about in terms of your year in Vietnam?
yeah, the only other thing that I would mention is the weapon. The weapon that I carried primarily was an M16. You have to understand that the M16 was a weapon that was awarded to the cheapest bidder. So it wasn't a very reliable weapon in Vietnam. I qualified because the reason I have two qualifications, that's the M16. Um, and it was notorious for jamming. Um, the the weather and sand in Vietnam was not very compatible with that particular weapon. But we ended up it ended up being a little more reliable as the year went on. But that particular weapon, the main advantage of it is if you think about an M14, which was the predecessor to that M16, it probably weighed half as much as it did, and consequently, you could carry more ammo. And this had a full auto um, position on it that was full automatic that would allow you to spray. The M14, if my memory serves me right, wasn't capable of doing that. So the weaponry was advancing at the same time. Some of the helicopters that we talked about, while we talked about um, Hueys and Chinooks, one bad piece of machinery was a Cobra, and that was a single slim helicopter that had an arsenal on it that they would use to prep landing zones, to get areas ready to land in, also for fire support. But the life expectancy of pilots weren't wasn't that great. So you didn't know, how long they were going to last. But that Cobra, which is now replaced by a Black Hawk, was a very very the Viet Cong and the NVAs feared that more than anything. And the other thing I'd like to say, Scott, is if you go back to those pictures, there's one of an anti-aircraft gun, 47 millimeter. This is one of the guns that we captured in Aisha Valley when we were there and brought back to to Camp Evans, and that's where this was. But that was one of them that we ended up. Cobra came in and just obliterated everything around this, and the gun was there, and we went in, picked it up, and took it out. So that was one less. That was a Chinese built weapon at that point too. So, but yeah, that the weaponry that was evolving, and the warfare style that was evolving in 68, 69, 70 was just dramatic as compared to World War II, Korea, and everything that happened. And I'm sure that the people from Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom and all of those are also in Afghanistan. I don't mean to overlook any of them. I mean, yes, you get disillusioned because, you feel like you're doing your best, you're fighting the battle, and it doesn't feel like we're going anywhere. I always say to everybody, when I left Vietnam, we were winning. And I think that until the last American troop went out in 72, I think we were still winning the war at that point. I believe that the Viet Cong and the NVA did not win that war. I think that it was just the ARVN troops that lost the war, very much like what happened in Afghanistan when we pulled out. They abandoned the positions that we had. So I was not disillusioned. You got to understand that I bleed red, white, and blue. Even now, I am still. I didn't talk about it. My wife, God bless her, is my soulmate and my cellmate with COVID, but she never knew of anything that I did in Vietnam until until I retired and finally realized that what I did wasn't bad, that it was something to be proud of more than it was to hide. They made us. I can still remember coming back, and after they had shut down the American involvement in Vietnam, every time that somebody from that had was remotely involved in Vietnam did something bad, it was a crazed Vietnam veteran, not just a person that was, a troubled person, but they defined us as crazy. And that disillusioned me far more than serving in the battlefield. That, we came back to something that people didn't fully understand what we had gone through too.
And I think that's a really good parallel to mention Afghanistan, because the students, of course, all saw those images right at the end of the summer, and there was an awful lot of parallels. I should define for you students just one term that Mark has used a couple of times. I should have mentioned it before, but I'll do a really quick share screen. A couple of times Mark has mentioned ARVN. Okay, that's the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. So they were the Vietnamese troops that were fighting alongside the Americans, just so you guys know what that phrase references. And students who have studied the Vietnam War a little more, you guys know, of course, the Americans and the South Vietnamese were fighting against North Vietnam as well as the Viet Cong, and that gets into just a whole other complicated part of the history. Now, Mark, in terms of the return home, you mentioned your DROS before. Can you tell the students what it was actually like coming home, like how they did this, sort of one-man thing? And I'd love it if you could talk about the Freedom Bird a little bit.
Yes, the Freedom Bird out of Cam Ranh Bay, April 3rd, 1969. I remember the day very, very well. I mean, you had done that year, it was behind you, and the blood, guts, and gore are all back there laying on a battlefield. You feel like you're abandoning some close friends, but you anxiously anticipate getting on that plane. And I can remember vividly, it was Flying Tiger Airline. And there's an acronym there that, Scott, someday I'll tell you about and chat with you about. But we when that bird started rolling down the runway, when the wheels lifted off, and there was a scream on that plane that was deafening of joy, for the if it was 250 people or 200 people on the plane. I guess at that point they weren't near as big as they were. It was a sense of relief, and 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 it was also a sense of abandonment. I mean, you know that there are still people there that are that had just got off of that plane, that had warmed that seat not more than 2 or 3 hours before you, that were going to go through what you went through. And it's not a good feel for that. As you can see, that this is one. I'm sure that they look grim in that one. Scott, they may be going in. uh, but The other side of this was that we ended up having, you know, a piece of meat, for a meal, and a drink on a plane that they gave us as we went in. Now, we took the same trail back. We went from Cameron Bay to Tokyo, Tokyo to Anchorage, Anchorage to Fort Lewis. I was fortunate that the First Cavalry Division was cycling through uh, Fort Lewis, Washington. While Fort Lewis wasn't exactly the most hospitable place, it was much better than San Francisco and 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 Los Angeles to come back to, because the war resistance faction wasn't near as bad in Fort Lewis as it was. That being said, we had we were told that they advised us not to travel home in our uniforms. Um, but I couldn't do that. I was proud of what I've done. Here I come back. I have a Purple Heart. I have an Air Medal. I have a CIB. I have survived a year in Vietnam, and I am kind of proud of what I've done, and I still haven't experienced all the resistance that everybody else had. Um, so yes, coming back was quite. Um, it was more memorable than the trip going there.
Very well said. And I was looking for an appropriate image to show there of Flying Tiger Airlines. I found a one here. Let me just do a very quick screen share on this, just so the students can get a sense of it. But you guys can see the pictures here off to the side. And these are Pan Am. I don't see a really good one online of Flying Tigers, but this picture, obviously right here, people are looking a little bit happier coming home. And Mark, you might find it interesting to know this woman right here. I actually had a phone call with her recently, and she's going to do one of these oral history projects with us fairly soon. She was a flight attendant on Flying Tiger Airlines, and she has some really interesting stories about the 3 years or so that she did that. This was a big moment for these people.
Don't close that yet. There's something that you need to see in that picture that is very near and dear to my heart. Look at that picture of her.
Yeah.
What's on her chest?
Look at Mark's t-shirt, guys.
Yeah. That's the First Cavalry Division patch. Every unit has its patch like that in the Army. And naturally, it's a source of irritation to somebody that may have been in the 25th Infantry Division or in the 4th Infantry Division, depending on who that was. And they always used to have a derogatory remark to make about it. With the 1st Cavalry Division, they always said, it's the horse they never rode, it's the line they never crossed, and the yellow speaks for itself, my friend. They used to say those, and we used to battle back and forth. And there's always unit rivalry within the Army too. So,
well, that was pure luck that I happened to find one of a flight attendant and a stewardess who was wearing the same one there.
It was difficult to adjust. You know, I never. I said earlier to you guys that a veteran never really leaves the war, and I brought it home with me. And I was married. I had got married just before I went to Vietnam, and my wife and I, we suffered that year together. And I was not very, I was not very nice, and 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 I was very, very difficult in trying to readjust and trying to figure out where I was and what I needed to do. Was very, very difficult for me. So that marriage terminated. My my dad is my biggest influence in that readjustment, and we went to a place whenever I came back. It would have been in April of 1969. I was 20 years old, not 21, And we went to being this Italian boy that I am, we went to an Italian club in Altoona, Pennsylvania, called the Abruzze Society, which my father was a member of. And we were sitting there, and I can remember sitting across the table from my dad, and he was having a beer, and he had told the bartender that I wasn't 21, but he had to give me a beer because I just had served a year there. And he said to me, you know, you're at a very big crossroad in your life right now. He said, you have a decision to make that is going to either make or break you as you go forward. He said, you can blame everything that's about to happen to you in life on this year that you spent in Vietnam. And he said that would be acceptable. He said I could understand that. He said, or you could pull up your bootstraps, you can go forward and do what needs to be done in order to make your life better. I chose that latter, and I took that year of Vietnam and I compartmentalized it and stuck it in the back of my brain that I never really thought about it again for 50 years. So it was a tough readjustment. But, I came back. I, I took advantage of the GI Bill, which allowed me to go to college at the government's expense. They paid for me to get a degree. I was the first in my family to get that degree. I like to think that I have um, been successful in life. Um, my my wife and I are living very, very comfortably, and I take that all back to that table that day with my dad. So it wasn't talked about. I mean, when I came back, people almost had a fear of people that had been in Vietnam because all they saw was that they were, you know, killers and trained to kill, and they did that all over there because of this image that the media portrayed of us. Um, and it so I mean, that's part of the reason that I tucked this away. I came back and people said, yeah, you were in. Nobody said thank you for your service, or the very first person that ever did that for me, that I remember so vividly. I did something akin to this with the U.S. Army Heritage Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They're doing a verbal history of Vietnam and putting it in the Army War College. And I actually did about a 2.5 hour, 3 hour interview with them. But the guy that ran it, a guy named Jeff Hawks, was an infantryman that was in um, Iraq. At the end of the interview that he did, and he was an infantryman and I was an infantryman, and he said, Mark, I just want to tell you that you people were our heroes. You were the people that we looked up to and modeled ourselves after. And when he said that to me, the tears rolled down my face, and I had never. He said thank you, and nobody had ever said thank you, and that was if I leave here today and I leave any impression on you whatsoever, I would ask you to say thank you to anybody, Canadian, United States, or Vietnamese, anybody that has served. That means a lot. So yes, I didn't have anybody that was actually anti-war.
You mentioned you came back and went to university, though. Did you run into any anti-war sentiment there?
No, I did that primarily at night. And you get a different class of people. I went to Penn State. I was working at the time for a manufacturing facility. I started going to school. I got my degree in industrial engineering, and I only ended up on the main campus. And that was not until later. Vietnam was over and done with by then. So it's going to be, I graduated in 1980. So that's how much later it was.
And I'll do a quick screen share here just so students can see some of these other images that relate to the period we're talking about right now. So students, of course, Mark was talking about his leaving the Army, and you can see honorable discharge right there in 73. And Mark, I'll talk to you subsequently about the remainder of your military service, the part after Vietnam. We have here, students, a nice certificate of appreciation. Who signed that for you, Mark?
Look at the name there. It's Richard Nixon. Tricky Dick Nixon. He was the only American president that was forced to resign his position due to Watergate.
And of course, we also have this certificate of appreciation, and the students aren't as liable to know the name Westmoreland, but he was the big general of the American Army during this period of time. Mark, what is your original given name?
Martian Guir is my given name. Martian was a 9th century Byzantine emperor that my mother knew nothing about, so I have no idea why that ended up being my name.
Well, that's very interesting. I happen to teach ancient history as well, and we're going to talk about the Byzantines in there, so I'll have to make up looking out something there.
The medal that means the most to me. There are. Can you bring up that picture of my shadow box, Scott? Okay, if you look at that, this is my wife had this done for me for my birthday. The one that means the most to me is just underneath the nameplate. That is the combat infantryman's badge. That puts me in a very elite group of people that not everybody can get that and wear that, but that is the most important medal, or badge. But the most important medal is on the left of that picture, and that's the Purple Heart. That's awarded once again to veterans wounded in battle. The second one is also very important to me, and that is the Air Medal, and that is equivalent to the Bronze Star for people in the cavalry that were in helicopters. If you did 26 or more combat assaults into a battle, you were awarded the Air Medal. So that those three are very, very important to me. All the rest are good conduct, and I always like to say thank you for coming. So just one interesting point, and I'll make this as brief as possible, Scott. In that picture also, you'll see that raised sword in the air, and it says Gary Owen. In the upper, beside the nameplate on either side, there are two of them exactly alike. Those, that is Gary Owen, which was the Irish tune that the lilt that George Armstrong Custer used when charging into battle, and George Armstrong Custer would have them play that song as they charged into Gettysburg, and he always led the troops into that battle, and that's one of the reasons I respect him so much. There's a question here about Veterans Day. I am serving this retirement home or village that I live in, and we have a group here that are a group of veterans that have about 25, anywhere from World War II right up through Afghanistan, because some of the people retired out of the service and did that. So we are doing a special service here for that, and it means a lot to me. And then the other thing I did is I sent you a picture of me in uniform recently. That is with the Red Rose Honor Guard that I serve, where we do services for deceased veterans that are, yes, that's one of them there, yeah, on the left, where we go to the funeral, we do a flag folding ceremony, we do a 21-gun salute, we play taps, and we give every veteran every honor that they deserve for every minute that they served in the United States military.
But upon returning, you decided to enlist again. What motivated you there?
Well, I thought that I might want to make a career out of it. I had talked to people that were, in Vietnam as we called them lifers. I mean, they were there for the career, and they had said that, once you get out of Vietnam, this military career, and my brothers also were contributory in that. Scott, my brother Nick was a lifer, Air Force, Army. I'm sorry, vice versa, Army, Air Force. He had went to Vietnam in the Army, came back, discharged from the Army, and went into the Air Force. And said, my brother had chatted with me and said, once you're through that, once you're through Vietnam, it's not a bad deal. And at that point, he thought that the war was winding down. So I really wanted to become a pilot at one point in life. And I thought, well, this might be an easy way to get into warrant officer flight school. But of course, I was still young and stupid, because had I gone to warrant officer flight school and got what I wanted, I would have probably ended back up in Vietnam again. But consequently, I signed up. They said, yeah, sign here. And I did that. And I ended up going to Fort Riley, Kansas for several months, just as an interim position. And then the next thing you know, I was transferred to the Second Infantry Division in Munsan, Korea, and was assigned a 71F clerk, mail clerk title. And I was driving a mail truck between Munsan and that was Camp Casey at the time, to Timpo Air Base, which was just an Air Force base where they flew the mail into. And I would run back and forth between that. And I can remember thinking to myself, what have I gotten myself into this time? So fortunately, I was able to get through it and get out of it, and not end up there as, because I certainly didn't want to become a truck driver the rest of my life. I finally did get out. I think I told you I went to university and got a degree, ended up working in manufacturing for a lot of years, ended up my career in manufacturing as a vice president in charge of operations. Ended up leaving that and going into, they wanted me to go to China, and I certainly didn't want to go to China. The company I was working for was transferring all the manufacturing it had here in the United States to China, which was the vogue thing to do around 2000. So I ended up getting licensures in all of the financial services. I ended up being a partner in a financial services organization where I spent the next 15 or 16 years of my life as a partner with them and a CFP. So.
Sorry, let me unmute there.
Okay.
Your time in Korea, were you ever up around the DMZ or anything like that?
Yeah, where we were was right up against the DMZ. We got to spend time, I didn't spend any time in an infantry division. It was all spent, in an admin company there the whole time I was there. But one of the good things that I was able to do was explore, some of Korea that I would not have normally had the opportunity to do. And yes, we did go up against the DMZ, and yes, we peered across there as I think every American soldier and person that ever goes there goes out and looks at it and is in awe of what they see there. But I ended up just coming back, and then that's when I got out of the military. Is when I came back from Korea. I whenever I derosed out of there, it was ETS, not deros at that point, estimated time of separation. And the separation happened on the 21st of June in 1971. And I was discharged because you had a reserve commitment of 2 years after that. In 73 is when the actual end of it was. So.
I'm pretty sure that's the date it says on your honorable discharge.
Yeah, that's right, because it did include that time there in the reserve, it was inactive reserve back then, because now they had so many people jammed into the reserves because of the residual people from Vietnam that joined the reserves and the National Guards and all of those that stayed here in the United States. Didn't have to do any service overseas. So
And I don't think that we asked this yesterday. I know I didn't, and I can't remember one of the kids. But what rank were you when you left the military?
I was a sergeant, an E5. When I came out of the service, now on my I had it here yesterday. I don't have it today, but I can grab it if you want to see it. On my color guard uniform, on the Red Rose Honor Guard, not the color guard. I am sergeant because the E5 that I was whenever I was discharged was specialist 5th class, and the Army, in its infinite wisdom, did away with that rank back in, I guess it was the late 70s, early 80s, and now there is not different classifications of specialist. It is just now you are just a specialist. Back then, you could go the whole way up to an E8 as a specialist, which was, as a sergeant major, equivalent to doing that. I think that they actually call them warrant. Some of those are in warrant officers' positions now, so they do that. But yeah, I am now in the color guard, or in the honor guard, a buck sergeant. That is basically what it is.
And I was curious about that because you mentioned the term lifers before, and that's a term that you often hear with a bit of a negative connotation. We did an interview not too long ago with Rick Weber. I don't know if you know him, but he's at the Veterans Breakfast Club quite often. He's a
Okay.
Vietnam vet too, and he went to officer training school, and he was a second lieutenant and so on. But he was drafted. And he vividly remembered that when he showed up in Vietnam he was there for 2 tours. The first day he met his company or his platoon, whatever it was, he vividly remembered the men immediately asking if he was a lifer, and they were thrilled, when he said that he was drafted. Did that term have that same connotation for you?
Oh yeah, there were very different connotations for lifer. That was actually an acronym that I won't repeat to you, but it was not a nice acronym for people that decided to stay in there. You know, Scott, I one of the things in my dislike in the very beginning, one of the things that I sensed that the Army was doing to me was it was developing discipline that I never had before. I mean, and my dad used to talk about discipline in a manner that he would say, Mark, that is not to punish. He said, discipline is the art of teaching. He said, as Christ taught the disciples, discipline comes that same thing. He said, and someday you'll learn that. You'll be able to understand that. And I began to get that as I was even going through Green Boot Camp in Vietnam. You had to be very, very disciplined. You had to be focused on survival. And if you weren't focused on survival, you probably weren't going to get out. So I recognized that the Army taught me discipline. And I realized that the people that were teaching me that discipline were the people that were lifers, and they were they were career men, I guess is the more PC statement rather than lifers. But I realized that they were the ones that had that quality that my dad talked about, that discipline, that need to get up in the morning and put your left boot on and put your right boot on, and after you put your slacks on. But I mean, you do everything in the same manner, and that became important to me in life. It's very, very, that rigidity was something that I needed, and I thought that the Army could do that for me. And it did take me long. They used to call me slow learner Turner, but I mean I sit back, I observe, I listen, and some of those things that I've learned by doing that is just that, is that you need that kind of discipline in life in order to survive and get to age 73 and survive a year in Vietnam, come back somewhat sane.
one of the questions that I think we got to in part, but maybe not in full. What about the issue of PTSD and your personal experience there?
Well, I guess that I suppress that. I think I suffer from PTSD? I think I do. I don't think any soldier ever comes back from battle or war and doesn't suffer from PTSD. I shuttered that all out of my life via, bad habits, alcohol, and nothing beyond that. I mean, I'm not by any means, a drugger or anything like that. But I did drink a fair amount back then, and I I wake many nights in cold sweats. I wake in bad dreams. So I'm back. And the one that really comes back repeatedly, the dream, is that dream in Asia Valley that I shared with you guys some yesterday. That one comes back to bother me. The wound, all of that doesn't. I mean, except for the fact that I have this terrible tinnitus too. After that, my ears rang, and now I said yesterday, this hearing is lost. I mean, it's totally gone in that left ear, and that's all part and parcel due to what happened there that day. And that doesn't really bother me, but that my first combat assault is the one that I live time and time again. There's that old saying, when did you come back from Vietnam? I didn't. I go there every night. Is what the adage is. So, but I think that I cope with it rather well. I mean, I try to. My wife and I have led a pseudo normal life, as normal as one I can lead that I participate in. But you know, that Agent Orange was I sprayed with Agent Orange. Once again, I don't think that there was any of the 2,700,000 veterans that served in country in Vietnam that weren't exposed to Agent Orange because they applied it liberally. It's like voting in Chicago, do it often and liberally. Um, you don't know, you know, what the long-term effects are. Well, my wife and I never had children. We married late in life. I think I told you yesterday, Vietnam cost me a wife, and it, no, that's not a fair statement. I cost myself. It was me. I know it was me, but I didn't know how to adapt when I first got back. You worry you're worried about people's perception of you, but you had this kind of not rage but anger, um, and I wasn't abusive physically or mentally, and knew that I didn't want to do anything like that. I didn't want to become abusive mentally or physically. So rather than do that, you terminate the source of that, and she was a very different person, and I was a very different person when we come back. It didn't work out. But anyways, I think that Agent Orange affected everybody that was there, that ended up, um, not not knowing what the long-term effect of that would be. There are people out there that are probably having children, and not just children, but grandchildren and generations of long-term effects for something that, the Veterans Administration, is that while they acknowledge it, what are they really doing to help those people? So, I suffer um, skin problems, and I don't, whether you know it's something that happened from Vietnam or something that is hereditary. You don't know that, so you do that. And I go through the Veterans Administration healthcare system, um, only only because I have a Purple Heart. I'd be redundant, or I'd be stupid not to have that redundant health care. I carry also my own private insurance too, but I do that only because I truthfully don't have all the faith in the world in the Veterans Administration, um, in the in your healthcare system. And that's not, I'm not taking a stab at the doctors or anything like that, but I just don't, you can, like, I'm having this trouble with my ear. I went in there a week or 10 days ago and they took a look at me and said, yeah, they have a new type of hearing aid that in the deaf ear, they put a hearing aid that is a receiver transmitter, and it transmits what you're hearing on this side to this ear so that you can hear what's being said on this side of you, instead of the way that I am doing now is I am constantly turning my head, and I have, well, other health, I have fused spine that had nothing to do with Vietnam, but it hurts to do that. And I'm waiting now for a week or 10 days, and I've got no response as to where that position is. So, it's, I, I, I still keep everything on the outside, just, to make sure that I can get the healthcare I need.
uh, Lots of bureaucracy, and that's
Oh my,
always a frustrating thing whenever you're dealing with that. So the Agent Orange thing was obviously something else I was going to ask about, but very much the idea that so many people have had different cancers or whatever, and there are
yes,
certain kinds where there's pretty clearly a causal relationship, but
sure.
there's obviously some uncertainty as far as that goes. I've been
And
a little.
and when
Go
I
ahead.
was when I was there, we were out, and while they were spraying that defoliant all around, while we were in the field, and you were touching it, and it was on leaves, and there were C-123s, or even they had Hueys that had big bars out the side of them that would actually spread it too. So I mean, it was everywhere. I mean, and God love those or help those people that end up with the prostate cancer and all of the blood diseases that they get from that. That I pray that they heal and get better. So.
Sort of a related question in some ways, but have you ever returned to Vietnam, or would you want to?
That's a really good question. Um, you know, you know who Rocky Blyer is?
Yeah.
Okay. He did a thing. If you ever get a chance, go out onto YouTube and look up, yeah, his return to Vietnam. It was an ESPN um, half-hour snippet, and it was I watched that one evening last Veterans Day. I'm sorry, last Veterans Day. Rocky Blyer spoke on the Veterans Breakfast Club, and I had just watched before that him returning there. He had, and I got a chance to question him, so it was kind of neat. I mean, you did this right, and do you know his story at all? I mean, yeah. Well, he talked about going back, and in this snippet, or in this little vignette that they did, he talked about when the camera was out there, he was in the field where he was wounded, and none of it looked familiar to him. I mean, he couldn't put himself in there. The heat, and he said it was hot and humid. He said he remembered that like the day he was there, and he passed out in the middle of this snippet. And I thought to myself, why would I ever want to go back to a place that I don't remember, and and chance that same kind of reaction? Now let's flip it 180 degrees. I would love to go back as a traveler, not as a veteran, but as a world. My wife and I have been, we've traveled a lot. We're fortunate, that we have not only the health, but the funds, and we're able to do that. And but as a traveler, I would love to go back and juxtapose in my mind, what it was then with the sewers running down the street, and what it is today, the modern Vietnam. You know, I don't think that I don't think that South Vietnam lost in any way, because had we prevailed and they had a democracy there, they would have very much been the same productive state that they are today. And even though the North Vietnamese and Uncle Ho did win in Vietnam, they end up where they probably would have been either way. The only sad part about it is it's tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of lives and families later that they ended up in the same place that they would have eventually ended up. So I would love to go there and take a look at that. So
My wife and I got lucky and went there a few years ago. I won a bursary a couple of years ago to do a history teachers kind of thing in Asia.
okay,
And it was to go to Korea and China. And we figured while we're there, let's
sure,
do a few other things. So we went to Japan and Vietnam really was quite beautiful. And I did make a point of trying to do a little bit of a history tour. I actually went to a veterans home there, and I was able to speak to some of the
ah,
largely North Vietnamese veterans. I had an
sure,
interpreter come with me just because I wanted to hear their
sure,
story. And it's not dissimilar. They were teenagers, they were conscripted, and it tends to be the same story all around the world whenever
yeah,
you speak to
yeah.
veterans.
And I would love to go back up into Hue and the Phu Vinh area, which is south of there, but Hue, An Khê, in those areas, that's where most of my memory would be embedded in I-core like that. The rest, the whole thing, Scott, to be very honest with you, is a blur. I mean, while I know that it was what was going on and I knew what was happening at the time, because of my, I guess it's inability to cope. I don't know, but or maybe it's my ability to overcope, and I shuddered that so far back in my brain that a lot of it is fuzz. I just can't imagine. So, anyways.
So another related question, on your return at any point, have you become a member of VFW or the Legion or anything like that?
Yeah, I have. I have become a member of the VFW. While I kidded and said or while I said that I drank some, that was at a younger age. But whenever I first moved to Mount Joy in the Lancaster area in 1985, there was an old veteran, a World War II veteran, that I had become associated with who was involved in the VFW. And Al said to me, Mark, you ought to become, he said, with your background and your history, you ought to become a member of the VFW. We need people like you. So consequently, I went there and I joined, and Al said, I wanted to write a check out, and Al said, you can't write a check out. I've already paid for a lifetime membership. So I have a lifetime membership in the VFW because of Al Whelan in Mount Joy, Pennsylvania. But now after that, I think I told you, I have joined the Red Rose Honor Guard here. And we do memorial services for veterans so that no veteran ever goes to the grave without having the flag folding ceremonies, without a 21 gun salute, without taps being played, and a proper and fitting burial that is attended by military people. I am emotionally involved. That's part of that prayer that I said that day in Isha. I every day, every time I do one of those, and I've just started this recently, so I've only done 15 of them. Last night we had a banquet that there were people there being recognized for doing 3,000. And we end up, I bow, I say a prayer, and I ask God to tend to that veteran and thank that veteran for service and want him to know in my mind that they'll never be forgotten, that they're always
And that process, is that something that's therapeutic for you?
very much so. It gives me a sense of relief that that I get to serve them as they serve this great country that we live in. I mean, and if it wasn't for us, who would have who else who would do it? And people often say to me, Mark, if you had it to do all over again, what would you change? Nothing. Absolutely nothing would I change. I would make this, I would do this again in a heartbeat because this country is worth it. And I don't know, that we have that sense of patriotism here anymore, Scott. It was, back then, it wasn't a question for me about going to Vietnam. Would have I liked to have gone to Toronto and sat back and met a guy like Scott and had a couple beers with him and lived there a few years, and then Ford or whomever it was gives me amnesty and I come back and it's all for naught. Wouldn't have Sure. But would I change anything? No, because I believe that God has a plan for us all. And that was part of the plan. It made me more of a man than I would have ever been had I not gone through that experience.
So you talked yesterday and today about the idea of opening the door on this part of your life. Like everything we're talking about here, is this all part of that open door? And do you feel like that's been a positive development for you?
Yeah, I think I told you yesterday about Jeff Hawks and the Army War College. I told you that, where that's where really I sat down and there were students like yours, and but there were two of them, and this is before COVID, so we were sitting across the table from each other. One was of Indian descent, and one was Anglo-Saxon American. I mean, you can see that. And I saw the interest that these young folks had, you know, um, that they were genuinely and sincerely um, curious and wanting to gain knowledge about this all. And then at the end, when Jeff gave me that thank you, it was like the floodgates opened. I it was that was a turning point in my life. I had that day with my dad at the Abruzze Society, this day with Jeff Hawks, you know, um, the day I met my wife. There's certain things that you register in your mind, and I think that all of those, it was the perfect storm of which way to go with this, and then finding the Veterans Breakfast Club. Well, with COVID now, with COVID, I ended up at it. This is not a thing to brag about, but I was one of the first 10 in Lancaster County to contract COVID. My wife and I are living in a retirement village that has 600 old people in it, like myself. We needed to isolate, and we did that for a very, very long period of time. I called her my soulmate and my cellmate. We spent so much time together, and it allowed me to really begin digging even deeper over the past 2 years into it. I did things like I have rebuilt that uniform that I had from Vietnam. I have joined the Red Rose Honor Guard. I researched that very, very deeply. I was able to rebuild that uniform because you dress in the same military regalia that you had whenever you were in the military. And I am learning that new discipline, that old discipline, as a new one all over again. So all of this has been very, very therapeutic for me, especially in a troubling time with these health issues that are traveling not only the country but me, and this ear thing, and I just and wanting to make sure that not only I can do things for my family. I have great, great nephews. Okay. So I can take them back to their great, great, great grandfather. And I am going, that would be my dad. And I can pass that on to them. So this sense of family and this sense of honor that this family has, not just in me, but coming to America in 1906, like my grandfather migrated from Italy in 1906, came into Ellis Island, was sitting there deciding whether to go to Boston or Altoona, Pennsylvania, when the San Francisco earthquake happened. He went to San Francisco and helped rebuild San Francisco for 3 years before he came back to, went back to Italy and Porto Corvino, where he was born, gather up his family, which then included my dad, and my dad was born there, but came over. I can take all of that back to all of them and then talk about the history of going through the wars. And all of us, all of my mother's side of the family and father's side of the family have been military people that have at least been, did stints. My dad did World War II. I have uncles that did Korea. Brothers, me that did, Vietnam. I have another nephew that was in Iraq. So, I mean, this goes on and on. I have another nephew still serving as a lieutenant colonel, no, as a full bird colonel in Hawaii at the Schofield Barracks. So, we have this huge history of military, and I want to be the one that helps pass that on and hope that they grab hold of that. So I realize that's a long explanation for a question that says, did this help you open up? Yeah, it did help.
That's good. That's, I think, an important point. This question I just like to ask out of interest, because when I have the students do some of the work on the video, I encourage them to include footage and music and so forth. What kind of music were you listening to back in the 60s when you went over?
Oh, it was a little bit of everything, but it was primarily the rock and roll back then, the Beatles, Creedence Clearwater, when I came back, Woodstock was happening. So I'm not although I didn't go to Woodstock, I really love the music that I got into that protest music, the Barry McGuire's on the Eve of Destruction and Creedence Clearwater and everybody that did that. I liked the music. I don't know that I liked the theme of the music, but I did like the music because that was what you had to listen to in order to do that. Todd sent out care packages last Veterans Day that he sent out for veterans, and in there were 2 discs. I have them here, but it has war, all of those songs on there, and I play them, and my wife says, oh, they bring back real memories to her too. So yeah, it was primarily what was popular at the time, and it was all good stuff.
And you just mentioned your wife. So your second wife, when did you guys meet?
We met in 1972.
So you had said before you were, keeping your history as a Vietnam vet very personal. Were you upfront with her right from the start about that?
No. Do you want to call her in?
It's totally up to you if you want to.
Hey, Linda. Linda, come here a minute. I want you to meet Scott. Here, pull that chair around here a second. He has some questions. This is the love of my life. This is Linda.
Hi, Linda. Nice to meet you. I was asking a question to Mark there. He was talking about coming back from Vietnam and closing, the book on that part of his life. And I just asked him when he met you, and he said it was 1972. I'm sure he got the year right and everything. Of
course.
And I asked him if he was upfront with you from the start about his Vietnam story.
No. He talked very, very little about it. It made him uncomfortable. We were in church one Sunday, and the Sunday school class somehow came up on that subject, and he just like froze. No, it wasn't until recently that he And it's an amazing story. I just wish I would have known it all before.
When did you start to feel comfortable to talk about it more? Like what year did that happen, Mark, that you started to, open up more?
I think it's when I retired.
Right before.
Yeah, just before I retired, I got, once again, I got to thinking about the fact that it wasn't, you know, it wasn't something to be ashamed of. I'm going to guess too, a trip to the wall in Washington D.C. was a part of that too. We went down. Linda and I were motorhomers for most of our lives, and we would travel throughout the country. And actually, we had gone just across to Gettysburg. And I said to Linda, we should get on a bus and get down to Washington, D.C. They had a tour out of Gettysburg that went down there. And so, it was something to do that day. When I went down to the wall, something happened there too. It was, oh, okay, this country didn't forget us, okay? And I had a hat on that said Vietnam veteran, and the people that walked by there, the young kids that walked by and would actually stop you and say, thank you for your service. My dad said you were in Vietnam. It was uncontrolled. I had uncontrolled emotions for most of the day there, that I teared up at everything that I did. And I was able to look up some of the names of the people that I knew that were on the wall. And it was an enlightening day for me that day. So, and I'm going to guess that was probably 2 or 3 years before I retired. Yeah. So that was a lot of it.
That's interesting. And thank you for sitting in there at the end. Did you ever press him on it? I'm curious, or did you just kind of let it take its course?
Once in a while, I'd ask a question and he would briefly answer, but I just left it take his, I'm sorry, I just left him take his course. It was something that was very personal with him. So, yeah.
Well, it's nice. It's nice that he talks about it now, and my students had a really good experience with him yesterday. Hopefully, Mark had an equally good experience with us.
Oh, I'm sure those kids won't forget Mark.
It was a good learning experience for them. They enjoyed it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
I'm gonna
sir.
scoot out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the last question I would ask Mark, it's kind of a general one, but it's always the question I finish with whenever I do an interview. Is there anything that you think that we missed? Is there like anything that came to mind that you wanted to discuss that I didn't ask about or that we didn't come to?
No, I think that number one, this is a very good experience for anybody that wants to go through that. I mean, for Vietnam veterans especially, I think it's a healing process. World War II vets and even Korean vets on Armistice Day, when they came back, there was a welcoming committee. There was never a welcoming committee for us all, but you guys are fulfilling that, fulfilling that need to. Do I need to be thanked for everything that I've ever done in my life? No. But you people make an effort to do that. And I so genuinely appreciate that. You don't know how many people that you have helped through a healing process by you, and what Todd does, and what the Army War College does, all of those in doing that. I think that every veteran out there should take the time to document this and do this with people like you. And then the other side of that is to serve. Make sure that people, that one of the more healing things is for me, or some of the more healing things for me, are Reese Across America and the Red Rose Honor Guard, and all of that service that you can give back, because we are really all brothers, Scott. we're all in this whole thing